The street circuit in Azerbaijan, in Baku city, has arguably the longest full throttle section of any circuit on the 2021 Formula One calendar. Spa-Francorchamps has a slight claim to that fame, and depending on which data you look at, you get slightly different answers. It'll be interesting to compare them when we get to Belgium and possibly even in Saudi Arabia at the end of the year. But that long straight has one big implication, Craig, and that's all to do with these things, the power units. And we haven't spoken much about power units this season so far, but for me it's one of the most fascinating parts of Formula One. But there's some very different approaches on display. Talk us through them.
So Formula One, as you say, the power units are absolutely incredible, and they really are the unsung heroes of the current sport. You know, we think back to the turbo days and everyone saying how fantastic it was when we had 1,000 horsepower or 20,000 RPM during the V10s. These are 1,000 horsepower to race with. It's absolutely incredible. Now, the way that the teams produce their power units and the differences are quite subtle. The basic regulations are really quite restricted in what you can do. So there's lots of factors that you can't change at all. So you've got a 1.6 litre V6 engine. You're stuck with a 90-degree bank angle. Even these mounting points are all in the same engines for every car. The turbo has to sit on the centre line. Lots of things you can't change. So really it then comes down to packaging, and then the really clever stuff is the detail and the programming of the hybrid systems deep inside the engine. So I've drawn some simplified Formula One engines just to show some of the basic differences. These aren't obviously 100% accurate. I don't think the teams would like us if I drew every engine perfectly accurately. So this is the Renault, and this is what you would call a vanilla type of Formula One engine under the current hybrid regulations. So the turbocharger is mounted at the back, so that's both the exhaust driven turbine and the compressor that delivers the boost back into the engine. The MGU-H sits in the middle of the engine in this V here, you can see it poking out the front, and the MGU-K sits over under the bank on your side of the engine. So that's all fairly standard, and the big differences really with the Renault engine to make it somewhat different is the inlet plenum. So this is where the air goes back into the engine, which has been compressed by the turbocharger, cooled by the intercoolers, goes back in to be mixed with the fuel in order to produce the power. So Renault have a system where the inlet ports, like most of the engines do, serpentine their way around to the back of the airbox here, or the plenum here, and then you have variable inlet trumpets moving backwards and forwards inside. Now normally in a race car you'd expect them all to be kind of poking upwards, and that's the kind of the classic shot you'd have from somewhere like Goodwood of mesh covered inlets. In Formula One engines now they all point forwards and they can move in and out to adjust the torque of the engine. Renault needs so much space for this that they've actually put the inlets going back into the plenum out on the side here, which look like a pair of kind of bug eyes sticking out. And these actually pass through the monocoque and then back out to the intercoolers. So it's quite an integrated package that Renault have got here. Possibly one of the reasons that the 2021 PU doesn't look that different from the previous one, because they are fixed in to some hard points inside the monocoque as well. So that's the Renault, and I think that's a good baseline for all of the current Formula One engines.
Yeah, and crucially, as you said, Renault haven't really changed very much for this year's power unit, and I think that's because they're hemmed in by this 2019 Renault RS19 chassis, which is actually the core of the Alpine A521. And that is the real secret here for Renault. They've still got this very low revving engine. We don't quite know why they've gone for this low revving approach. No other team's done it. They have probably at 800 RPM peak less than any other power unit in Formula One. So they're using that V6 engine in a very, very different way to every other team. Possibly something they've worked out with their fuel supplier, possibly something in the combustion. But it just makes me think that, yeah, there's a little bit of a secret in there. We'll probably not really see them realise that until the 2022 season though.
Now we move on to the Ferrari engine, and this is in the sort of same family of engines as the Renault because the turbo is behind the engine. It's a closely coupled turbo as the Renault had. But Ferrari have slightly different ways of getting the air to and from the turbocharger, which actually affects the engine in other ways, but perhaps slightly unexpectedly, and could lead to some performance issues. So you have the exhaust blowing the turbine at the back of the engine. Then you have the compressor that gets spun up. So that needs to get some air from the roll hoop inlet through the airbox, and that has to come up over the plenum. But what Ferrari also do is the air that is then compressed and the boost air comes up and over the plenum as well, and down to an intercooler at the front of the engine, because they use a water-cooled intercooler rather than ones in the side pods. big complicated thing we won't get into today. What this means is there's lots of stuff going on in between the plenums on the Ferrari, which means that the plenums can't be as big, and again these inlet ports are somewhat restricted in how they can be shaped around there. Now we've not seen the exact detail of the current Ferrari engine, but this was certainly the case with last year's engine, and I've got no reason to believe they would have made big changes in that respect for this year.
There were a lot of changes to the Ferrari engine year on year, but Ferrari haven't detailed all of those changes. I believe they've got a new engine block, so they've created a new engine block. There have been some pretty substantial changes, but there are a lot of rumours about Mercedes opting for a split turbine layout for this season, and some people are actually reporting that as an absolute fact. I'm pretty certain that's not true. You and I have both had a good look at the back of that car now. I'm pretty sure they haven't got a split turbo on their car, but they are rumoured to be adopting that approach in 2022. And the split turbo has been one of the clear decisions of this generation of Formula One power unit.
So now, looking at the Honda, you can see there's something quite different with the layout of this engine. Much of the basic architecture is exactly the same, but now the compressor side of the turbocharger is mounted on the front of the engine. The turbine section, still driven by the exhaust, is still on the back, so they're joined by a long shaft with the MGU-H still sitting in the middle of the V. And this is what Mercedes introduced back in 2014. This was the big concept they introduced to Formula One. I've never seen anything quite like this in any other category of turbocharged motorsport or even road cars. Lots of different theories about what this is all about in terms of performance, thermal management, even in terms of weight distribution, which isn't a factor with these engines because that is actually fixed by the regulations. So the main difference is that it's much easier to package. So Renault and Ferrari have got to bring air to the turbocharger, somehow over the back or around the side, and then bring it back out to the intercoolers, which means more pipes. With this setup, it's in the front of the car. Now Honda in the Red Bull still use air-to-air intercoolers, like a big radiator in the side pod. So this air comes out of the turbo, goes out to each side and then goes back into the top. And it just makes for a much neater, tidier package. And this really is the kind of the key thing that Honda immediately leapt on, and everyone therefore is rumoured to be trying to implement for 2022. Again, lots of wild rumours about people doing it in this year, but I just do not believe that they're true.
A lot of conversation happened in 2014 when Mercedes were first discovered to have used this layout. And there's one story I absolutely love about how they came up with this idea. The Mercedes engineers in 2013, 2012, when they were studying these new technical regulations, what does this engine look like? What does a turbocharger look like? And the Mercedes HPP engineers at that time had never designed a turbocharged racing engine. They had to consult with the Daimler truck division on how to design a really big turbo like this. But the other thing they did is they went, and this is a rumour, but I believe it to be true, and some people at Mercedes have said it's absolutely true, others have said it's absolutely not, so you'll have to take your own read on it. They went to a university in England, Cranfield, and they went into the library there. And if you go to Cranfield University, it's at an old airfield, and there's a big old Rolls-Royce Pegasus engine, the engine from the Harrier jump jet aircraft, military aircraft, and that has a split turbine and compressor layout. And when these engineers were doing the book research at Cranfield University, they went and looked at this old jet engine while having a cup of tea and thought, that's a good idea. And that's how they came up with what is nicknamed sometimes the Pegasus turbo layout. Now, whether this story is true, as I say, I'm not entirely sure, but I love the story and I want it to be true. So therefore, that's why I refer to these sometimes as split turbos or Pegasus turbos. And then Honda engineers, well, they had the same idea. They'd seen the same photos in 2015 when they joined Formula One with McLaren. They'd had a year of looking at the Mercedes and decided that is also a very good idea. And I think we are going to see more and more teams adapting that layout for next season. The one that may not do it is Renault, but with these power unit specifications frozen from the start of next season all the way through to the brand new power units in 2025, which I'm very excited about, that's the layout. But Honda hasn't just been innovating when they first came in with their overall layout. They've done quite a lot this season as well, haven't they?
That's right, Sam. So what I've drawn here is a slightly disassembled version of the Honda engine, again, very simplified, and they made lots of changes to the architecture of the engine within the limits of the regulations. So they've done a couple of things. First of all, in the block and the crankcases, what they've done is they've moved all of the cylinder bores closer together, which effectively makes the bulk of the engine much shorter. And what they've also done is with a V6 engine, because each pair of cylinders opposite each other share the same crank pin, one bank is slightly offset from the other, and they've actually swapped the offset from one side to the other over on this year, which is again a packaging thing and just allows you to get all of the ducting and everything out the front of the engine, just done that a little bit more efficiently. So that one is more about packaging on the chassis. The other thing they've done is something that benefits both the engine and the chassis, which is on the cylinder heads. So what Honda had before, you have the double overhead camshafts inside the head. They were quite high and quite wide apart. And what that means is as the valves come down, you get quite a pent-shaped combustion chamber. And they felt this wasn't really working for them. So what they've done is they've brought them lower and closer, as you can see here. And this makes for a much flatter combustion chamber, as you can see along the bottom here. And they've found this has really helped with their combustion because of the way that the pre-chamber ignition works. This wider chamber actually works very well. Does have some knock-on problems. It actually makes, because it's so efficient, it actually means that the heat coming out of the exhaust, the pressure coming out of the exhaust is slightly less. So they've actually lost some of the turbocharger effect, but the whole effect for the engine means that this is, you know, a better solution for them. For the chassis designer, just as having a shorter block, having a narrower and lower head means that they can bring the bodywork back around much tighter. And what you then see is this classic triangular shape. Because you're fixed to have these mountings here and mountings there in a set position, you're never going to get rid of these. You have to run them. So making space in other areas around it means you can just bring bodywork in. And let's face it, Red Bull are the leading exponents of shrink wrapping that bodywork round to the back of the engine.
Now, there are going to be some designers at McLaren who are really going to be very envious of this, even though they've switched to Mercedes and they're quite happy with their power unit. When Honda first came into Formula One in 2015, they attempted what Ferrari had tried in 2014, what's nicknamed a size zero power unit, to make it as small as possible, perhaps increase weight, perhaps lose a bit of engine performance, but you trade it off for aerodynamic performance. For Ferrari in 2014, that was a complete disaster, and for Honda in 2015, that was also a complete disaster. Well, this 2021 power unit, which is far from a disaster, it's very competitive, is smaller than that 2015 size zero power unit. So they're calling it smaller than size zero. And to be able to achieve such a tight and small power unit, particularly in the cylinders, some of the Honda engineers in their factory at Sakura City in Japan, near Utsunomiya, famous for its gyoza, they came out with a completely new coating to use inside. And it was actually done by a little sort of booth in the side of the factory. The engineers came up with it and they coat the little parts and make it can deal with more heat and different levels of friction in ways that no other power unit in Formula One can do. It's real engineering innovation at the front line. And this is the basis of the power unit that Honda are going to be running all the way through till 2025. So all of this innovation from Honda right now is super crucial. But how involved will Honda be going forwards with the new Red Bull powertrain? It's still a matter of some conjecture.
Then to finish up, the daddy of the current hybrid power units, Mercedes, they've obviously been running this setup since 2014. They've huge amount of performance in their engine, way above their rivals, and they've carried that advantage all the way through the subsequent seasons. But Honda and, you know, as we've seen this year, Ferrari are pushing them quite hard. So they knew over the winter they had to make some changes. Again, much of the basic architecture is the same. They've still got the split turbo, so there's no change there. So they've looked again at the plenum. So as I said earlier, normally the inlet tracks go round the back of the engine, turn around and come forwards. And with boost pressure, you can kind of do that. You wouldn't be able to do that with a normally aspirated engine. But with boost pressure and with the flow you can get from a turbocharger, you can get away with that. But Mercedes have decided that they will go almost back to more of a conventional setup. So now the inlets come up vertically upwards. So they're like the classic race car, pointing upwards. And this has meant that they've had to make these very large bulbous plenums. Whereas the previous ones were like kind of a Toblerone triangular section either side, which fitted neatly under the bodywork. Now you've got this big section slightly outboard of the inlet. And that is why we see the big bulges on the Aston Martin and the Mercedes. Obviously Williams and McLaren have taken a slightly different aerodynamic route and they don't have that problem, but with the shrunken rear ends of those cars, this is the part that you see under that blister.
Now, one of the biggest changes Mercedes made to the power unit itself, they did come with a new engine block this year. They had reliability problems. You may remember Sergio Perez blowing up in Bahrain in spectacular fashion last year, and the team found, the Mercedes engineers found, that there was a problem with some of the components, so they came back with a completely new, and again another engineering innovation, and one they won't tell us too much detail about. They came up with a new specification of metal alloy, aluminium alloy, to use in the engine block, and that's made them have a far more reliable power unit. And it seems to be working. They haven't had any frontline failures on the power units this year so far, but let's see how it goes for the rest of the year. But Mercedes, once again, pushing the limits of power unit design. There's always stuff going on in the world of power units in Formula One, and I, for one, am super excited to see the next generation of power units in 2025.